You're listening to the Balanced Educator Podcast, episode number 108. Welcome to the Balanced Educator. We're your hosts, Kaylee
and Josiane from EduCalm. Our intention is to equip and empower you to feel more calm, balanced, and joyful in all aspects of your life.
Hello there and welcome. We are so happy to be connecting with you here today. So in today's episode, we are going to be talking about how to create a safe space in our classroom for students that are experiencing trauma. Now, I know that many of us aren't in the classroom right now, but we thought that this interview with Jacob Chastain was just so valuable. We wanted to share it with you, even though you might not be in a physical classroom. And as you listen to this episode, I'd love for you to sort of consider, when we do return to classroom spaces as normal one day, how can you apply what you're learning from this conversation to that physical space of a classroom? But also, if remote learning continues to be our reality in the future, how can we start infusing some of these things into our practices as teachers that aren't in the same physical space as our students? And how can we use what we're learning today to inform how we connect with our students that might be in a home that is difficult and includes traumatic experiences? So try not to get overwhelmed by the worry of what those students that are at home during remote learning are experiencing, and try, I guess, your best to think of this in a light of, okay, how can I use this information to inform my practices in whatever our reality looks like? Because we can't change the fact that we're in the classroom or we're teaching from home, but we can adapt to the situation to do the best we can in the situation that we're presented. For many of us teachers, it is weighing so heavily on our hearts for our students that we know don't have ideal living situations, and the fact that we can't create that physical safe space for them right now is just heartbreaking and difficult. So let's try to learn from this conversation and find creative ways to create that connection with our students that really need it, even when we're teaching from home. So before we dive into today's episode, we are excited to share today's sponsor, Zero Waste Movement. So you've heard us talk about how much we love Zero Waste Movement and how this brand helps us to live more eco-friendly and sustainably, because they create these awesome products that are beautifully made, durably made, so they last a long time, and they help us to reduce our use of single-use items and plastic items in our life. So I am a huge fan of Zero Waste Movement's beeswax wraps. I also really love their dish scrubber. It is the perfect balance between getting the dirt off your dishes, but also not scratching your dishes. It's made of wood and these plant fibers for the bristles that are just perfect. Highly recommend this company. Go check them out if you want to reduce your single-use items and live more sustainably. So go to Zero Waste Movement. So that's Zero Waste MVMT, like movement without the vowels, zerowastemvmt.com. And when you use the code EduCalm, you'll get 15% off your order. All right, let's go to today's show. Recently, we've had requests from you, our community, to talk about the subject of trauma here on the podcast. So today, we've invited Jacob Chastain onto the show to share his story with us and his experience. Jacob is the host and creator of the Teach Me Teacher podcast. He's an author, speaker, a former literacy coach, and he's currently teaching grade 6 English in Fort Worth, Texas. In this interview, Jacob tells us the story of what it was like for him to grow up in a household filled with drugs and violence, and how school was his safe place, and his teachers were always there to support him. This is a really inspiring interview, and I think you're going to have so many takeaways and feel better equipped to support your students, especially those that might be going through traumatic events in their personal lives. All right, so let's get into this super inspiring interview with Jacob Chastain of the Teach Me Teacher podcast. Jacob, thank you so much for being here on the Balanced Educator podcast with us today.
Yeah, super pumped. I love the conversation and talking to people. So it's always fun to be on the other side of things for a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. I'm Jacob Chastain. I am a former literacy coach, current 6th grade and 7th grade. I just got a 7th grade block actually at the semester change over here in Fort Worth, Texas. I run one of the top educator podcasts called Teach Me Teacher, and it is a labor of love that turned into a business. Podcast host, creator of Teach Me Teacher LLC, co-founder of Unchained, which is something coming out very soon, and I'm the author of the book Teach Me Teacher, where I tell my life story and how teachers saved me from the family that I grew up in, the situation that I grew up in, and it's part memoir because it's part my story growing up, but it's also my first 4 years of teaching and how I started realizing that my world that I lived in was shaping me as a teacher in ways I hadn't seen before, and just how those stories made me become a better teacher in a lot of different ways. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Thank you for sharing. So I started reading your book, and it is so filled with emotion, and I just couldn't stop reading. I'm going to have to buy it. I read the excerpt from your website, and I'm going to have to buy it now so that I can keep reading, because it it gave me all the feels. Would you be able to share a bit of your story of how you grew up with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, and I tell this story quite a bit, but in a lot of ways, my story isn't that different from a lot of people's. I had, our family where mom, dad, a sister, and 2 brothers. And we kind of grew up in kind of middle America, just making pretty good money. I was really never hungry. We had cars and we had gaming systems, you know what I mean? We weren't really bad off in that sense. But as I got older, I started realizing that things that I thought were normal really weren't. For instance, my mom, she struggled with addiction along with my dad that progressively got worse as I got older. They were primarily addicted to pain pills, but there was a lot of drugs involved. But they would, I would grow up and not want to leave school because I wasn't sure if my mom could drive home. There were so many times when she was on the wrong side of the road, or I had to grab the steering wheel because we were about to hit a car. And that was in elementary school, middle school, pretty much all up until I could drive myself. And that was just common occurrence, but I thought that was normal. There's really nothing about that situation that showed me that something was wrong. And then, slowly my friends would come over and they'd be like, why is your mom asleep in her food? Where's your dad at? And there was that over and over again started showing me that things were bad. And as I got older, it became more apparent to me. So it became a battle of me, protecting my nephews around me, and really just trying to find ways to survive parents that really, they were so preoccupied with their addictions that they really weren't too concerned with what was happening with me. And luckily, I had teachers who not only knew that story, but took care of me in ways that I didn't even know at the time. They were always there to talk with me and give me outlets that I didn't have. They were there. A story that I love to tell is when I was in high school, I totaled my mom's car because I was driving to school I was going to school, but my mom was in jail. My dad was gone. So I was just driving myself to school and I didn't see a car coming, and I ended up totaling this car. And the people I called were my drum directors. I was on drum line. So they came and picked me up, and they took care of me and kind of helped me through that situation. But that's just one story of literally hundreds of people around me who took care of me. But that world is so pervasive, addiction and people that live in addiction and kids that live with people who are addictive. And, my dad was abusive, and that stuff, it becomes so much a part of you that you don't know anything different. And the main piece to that story is, it really wasn't until I was an adult and really into teaching that I realized that, like, I was a different person because of these experiences. And my whole life, pretty much up until this point, has been me processing through that and, learning that, like, the compassion I have for students is a direct correlation to the lack of compassion my parents had for their children. And that's really hard to articulate, but that is fundamentally what my story has led to.
Wow, what a intense story. And thank you so much for opening up and sharing that. As teachers, it can be so hard when you, A, don't necessarily know what's going on with your students at home, and B, maybe if you do know what's going on with them, what you can do to support them. Where is the line as a teacher of how you can be there for that student? Could you tell us a little bit about maybe some stories you have of how teachers were there for you, or what did it feel like for you as a child growing up in that environment? What was school like for you?
The one thing that school was for me over and over again, even in class, like, in my book, I name a lot of the teachers who were there for me because I remember them. I remember their faces. I'm still in contact with many of them because I work in the same district I went to school in. So I've worked with several of them as a professional. So it's pretty fascinating, but even the teachers I don't remember, in the classes I can't really name, those I still have fond memories of most of it, because the major thing that any of these teachers did for me was just be there. When you're living in chaos, the one thing that you can look forward to is a constant of some sort. We've all heard that kids need habits and they need ritual and they need these things. And, that's one of like the pillars of good classroom management. And kids that live in chaos at home, it's even more important because, when I was going home those days, I didn't know if my mom and dad were going to be in a fist fight. I didn't know if my sister was going to come home and take care of her nephew. I didn't know if anyone in my family was going to be sober that night. And that's a real reality in a bunch of different areas for so many kids. It's rampant in our culture, and it's not even addicts really. It's parents who aren't there because they're working. We make the assumption that, like, kids that deal with trauma, it always comes in the form of these really extreme stories and kids going through abuse and dealing with drug addicts and stuff like that. And really, trauma can come from being neglected. And neglect here is being used as both parents just literally having to work so much that they're never around, but also parents just not being there for their kids. I think there's an epidemic of a lack of compassion and love for children. And we blame technology, but the people around them are the people that are not giving them what they need. So they turn to the devices because those devices give them, on a very superficial way, what they're looking for. So to bring this back to what teachers did, the best teachers I had were the ones that I could look to and say, hey, I know that you're going to listen to me and you're going to pay attention to me, even when I'm being a butthole, right? Like, even when I'm being the worst student and not doing any of my work, which I did often. My parents weren't around, like, why would I do homework? But, there's one of my high school teachers. She taught me twice. She taught me my freshman year. She taught me my senior year. She was my academic coach at my campus that I first worked at, and then she was my vice principal, and I'm still friends with her today. So she's like my guru, my muse, my life coach. She's all of these things for me. But the major thing that she did for me was she gave me a way to express myself in ways that some teachers will not want kids to do. What I mean by that is, she was an English teacher, so we wrote and we talked and stuff like that. And my stuff, as I got older, the way I coped with the world that I was living in is I tried to rationalize it. So I read a lot of argumentative books. I read a lot of philosophy books. I read a lot of science books. I read tons of Carl Sagan and Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and like all of these huge thinkers who forced me out of the bubble that I lived in and into a world of intellectual discourse. And I was annoying, right? Because when we would, have these discussions in class, and I would always, play devil's advocate just because of the way I was. And her class, she gave me that outlet. She allowed me to be pompous and obnoxious and whatever. But she slowly coached me how to do that in a way that wasn't so abrasive. Now, that's still something I'm learning, but that's what I remember most, was that I could go to her class and take all my teenage angst and take all of my trauma and all of my problems and have these really great passionate discussions about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have problems, and what does it mean, like, if we're diving into Shakespeare or something like that. We read Hamlet in my senior year and, really discussing the implications of like a moral life from Hamlet. Like, that's stuff that stuck with me as a teenager because she built a foundation in her classroom that allowed me to be comfortable in that. And it was also an escape. To take it to elementary, one of my third grade teachers, she gave me, we would sing in her class, right? And I'm not like a public singer. I'm not a good singer, but I remember, this is around third grade, like my family was beginning to deteriorate in a lot of ways. And I remember just being so comfortable in her class. We read books in her class and we sat on the carpet together. And I always knew that she would be the one smiling at the door. And that's just my story over and over again, is teachers just being there. They probably weren't all the most amazing teacher, but just by being something I knew that was there completely changed the course of my life.
That's amazing. Just that constant source of structure and compassion. And it sounds like school has been such a big part of how you developed into who you are today. And I just find that so inspiring and so important for us teachers to remember, especially on the tough days, how important it is for us to just be there for our students.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that message. How has your experiences as a student translated into what you do in your classroom to be that constant for your students?
This was a slow process because one of the things that a lot of people don't know, just because, I talk about it a little bit on the podcast. So if people have been following me for a few years, then they know some of this story, I tell it in the book a little bit, but, I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I didn't know what I wanted to do, in all honesty. I just went to college and was just kind of working at the same time. I had a kid at a fairly early age when I was about 20 or so. So I was still in college, still trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew I had to make money. And eventually I was in a job that was basically collapsing and I was about to lose it. People were getting laid off. And I called that high school teacher I just told the story about. And I said, hey, I think I'm going to lose my job soon. Do you have a way that I can come like sub? I feel like I could this might be the career path I want to take. I've always thought about teaching. I just never really pulled the trigger on it or whatever. And she goes, yeah. And I sent my resume over and stuff like that. And one thing led to another. And I ended up getting into an alternative certification program here in Texas. And it literally right after I graduated. So I graduated like in June, sometime May, June. And then that August was my first teaching gig, teaching 8th graders. So no subbing experience, no experience with kids whatsoever. And they throw me into an 8th grade social studies classroom. right? Because I passed my generalist test, and
Yeah.
once you pass it and you're in your program, I mean, they hire you on. You're an intern, but you're paid like a teacher. You do everything a teacher does,
Yeah.
for a year until you're official. So this process of learning how to use this information came very slowly because everyone's been a first year teacher before, and you know we praise everyone who makes it past the first year, because first year can be very difficult. And mine was. I was a horrible teacher. I had terrible classroom management. I didn't know what a quiet signal was for like 6 months. Like everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong. But luckily, I had a lot of really dedicated coaches. I had a fantastic partner who literally took me under her wing and was like, "We're going to make it through this." And I had a lot of teachers who made sure that I failed, but made sure to help me find the solutions within that failure. But as I started, around year 2, I really started to process what I needed to do. When things started to calm down, I also moved into English language arts, which was my passion. I love social studies, but books, literature, writing, that's my jam. So once I got into there and started becoming just a more competent teacher, I started really connecting with kids. And what happened from then was I started seeing my story in different places. I started seeing students who didn't want to go home, and I started to see kids who would rather do anything. It would do anything for you if they knew that they could trust you. And that resonated so much with me because to this day, lying is something that I just can't tolerate. Like, it bothers me to no end because I lived in that forever. And when I see kids that do not respect adults who lie to them, even about small things, right? I mean, we're talking about people who, like, when teachers like try to pass off a bad assignment, like, "Oh yeah, you're going to need this." It's like, no, kids can see through that. They can see through fake assignments. They can see through things that that aren't all authentic. But and to teachers' credit, not everything we can do can be 100% authentic,
Yeah.
but we can try to push it a little farther. And when I see that, I go, yeah, that's me. I get it. And once I started channeling that, I started serving my students so much better. I used to yell at kids to get them to be quiet. And you know what? Every year for the last 3 years, students at some point go, "Chastain, you just don't yell. You don't yell. Like, are you?" And I had a student the other day. She goes, "Chastain, why don't you ever have a bad day?" I looked at her and I was like, "I definitely do have bad days. I probably had a bad day this week." But then I was honest. I told her, I said, "I don't think it's right for me to bring that onto you guys. I don't think it's right for the kid in my last period who made me mad to bring it into you. Like, it's not fair to you. It's also not fair that I yell at you because you're a child and you're still learning how to be a human being."
Yeah.
And that's not to say that, like, people who yell, like, we're treating kids wrong. There's probably a million reasons why it's good to raise your voice in some instance. I just don't feel like I get much bang for my buck out of it.
Yeah.
In my experience, the calmer I am with students, even when they are driving me insane, even if they've done something crazy or I'm having to get on to them, I feel that they respect the discipline I'm giving them far more than that. And that goes back to, my dad yelled at me all the time. When I was out of line, my dad walked up to me and he would poke me in the chest as hard as he could and ask me, "Why did I do this? Why did I do that?" And I remember what that feels like. I remember what it's like to have an adult scold you for just being a kid. Kids are dumb. Like, we make mistakes. You know what I mean? Like, you're still learning. I said this before, you're still learning how to be a person.
Yeah.
And it's my job as the adult to understand that, respect it, give you as much empathy as I possibly can, and try to help you make the right decisions. That does not mean baby them. It does not mean coddle students. It doesn't mean any of those things. What it means is being a good person, because in the end, that's really what kids need. They need a model of what it means to be kind, generous, and respectful. And they learn so much from us. Last year I was a literacy coach and I walked into so many classrooms and with the same kids, and you can tell the difference. you can tell when there's a classroom environment of respect. When the teacher respects the kids and gives them compassion, their kids do that. And when teachers do not do that for their students, and their teachers are very high anxiety and yell and do all these things, their kids reflect that. It's human nature. And I think my life, for as much craziness as it was, prepared me to be the calm among the storm for a lot of the kids that need it most.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And we totally agree. We're always talking about how being the energy that you want to see in your class. So if they're loud, get quiet. One of my favorite tricks is when the class is really loud or they're talking over me. I start whispering, and then they all have to lean in close and really listen, so kind of but it's so easy to match their energy and go up and get loud when they're loud. But it's definitely a practice and something that you learn over time that just yelling over it doesn't work so well.
Well, it's also human nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when a kid is rude to you, like it's human nature to want to be rude back.
And
it's human nature to want to yell back or something like that. But unfortunately, we're in this job of education, and we have a responsibility to not always respond with our most basic instincts. I think there's a lot of pressure on teachers, and I believe that pressure in a lot of ways is valid. I think we have so much responsibility. We're entrusted with people's children. We're entrusted with, in my first year when I was struggling super bad, my principal, after my first horrible observation, she came to me and we reflected on it, and she was very kind, despite the fact that it was a terrible, terrible class that she watched. My fault, not theirs. And she goes, Chastain, I know you're learning and everything like that, but the way she focused me, she said, this is their only 8th grade year. She goes, you're their 8th grade social studies teacher. And I remember that every day I go, I have to be on my game, because any misstep, and we'll make missteps. I'm not batting 100 for 100 here. You know what I mean? But But any misstep is a potential gap that we're giving a kid that has no choice. And I think that is a burden that we bear, but it's something that we have to take seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that just came to mind after reflecting on what you talked about with what stood out to you with the teachers that you had, is just that question of, what am I going to be remembered for? Am I going to be that teacher that, as your students said, like, how come you're always so happy, or you never yell? That teacher that they're always going to remember, that was cool and calm with them and there to support them when they needed them, and gave that leeway to make mistakes, but then be coached through it, just like your high school teacher did, gave you the chance to, be a little intense, but then coach you how do we talk in a better way. And that's so awesome. So who do you think about that? Do you reflect on that? Like, what teacher do I want to be for them? How are they going to remember me?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, and I'm an artist and a performer. I grew up playing drums. My earliest memories are really of sitting in front of my dad's drum set while he was playing drums, at our little lake house that we had, and he would just play. And, there's old home videos of me just sitting in front of his drum set with drumsticks, as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, and just watching him. And that performance is so much a part of my life, that I'm a performer to the core. It's just, when the mic's on or the camera's on or the kids walk in, I'm performing. And I know a lot of teachers aren't like that necessarily, but that's definitely something that I think about. So everything I do, and I've developed this over time, but it's really intentional. I wear a suit every day, in a tie and I dress up because I think that if I need kids to remember me, I want them to go home and think about and remember Chastain, and I want, and I do huge lessons, and I turn my room into a cave and have kids crawl into the dark with flashlights because I want to give them an experience of something they've never done before and may never do again. I stand on tables because a lot of kids walk through our hallways with their heads down. I want them to look up because I want to give them a reason to put their chin up for at least 10 minutes a day. And that's why that stuff drives me, and because I want them to want to run into my classroom. I don't if there are days where a kid is not excited to come into my room, I'm doing something wrong. And I want them to, and I think my classroom, I have my door open. I'm always standing in the hallway. I have the whole hallway. We're dancing to the music coming from my room, and that energy is infectious. What happens when you start bringing that energy? People around you start seeing that energy, the kids and the other teachers. And you know what? A brand new teacher across my hallway, she saw all the excitement that we were having running in the room. She got a speaker. Now she's jamming, and we have all of this happening because that's the teacher I want to be. I want to be the teacher where when kids think about what a teacher is, they think about me. They think about someone who isn't sitting at my teacher desk during class time. I'm sitting with them, and we're having great conversations, and we're learning, but we're also having fun because we're human. I don't want their memory of my classroom to be, yeah, that one time he gave me an F for this reason. I want them to think about the cool stuff we're doing and how I empower them and how I don't litter my walls with content all over the place. I litter my walls with the pieces that they write and the poems and the essays and the stories that they write. And because it's theirs, it's not mine anymore. And that, that's the stuff that for me, that's my style. And I think every teacher needs to ask themselves what that is. Every teacher's not a performer. Every teacher isn't going to blast music. It might make them nervous to sit there and blast music,
Yeah.
But I think every teacher has a style just like every person does. And I think the more that you are you, the more your kids are going to love it. And they're going to go, that's what great teaching is. That's what a great teacher is. And I think when we're struggling the most is when we're not living the teacher life that we think we should. It's when we're compromising what we believe or want our rooms to look like because of pressures from the district or pressures from the principal or perceived pressures about test scores. Test scores is like the bane of my existence because every bad decision I've ever made about teaching is based on a test score. Mm-hmm. And I have gotten better about not doing that. But it still creeps up every once in a while. And I'll go, man, why am I not enjoying my classroom this week? And I go, oh, I'm making decisions based on fear of this or that. And I think we have to push to be the teachers that we want to be. And for me, it's bigger than life, high energy, high compassion, high authentic reading and writing. And I think the joy that comes from my students and the work that they're doing truly reflects the fun we're having.
Thank you for sharing that. I'd love to know, do you have sort of like a core value that you'd like to instill in your students so that once they've left your classroom, there's like this one core thing that they've really taken in and that they'll take with them?
That's a great question. Probably not consciously, if I'm being 100% honest, but I think everything that I do, especially in the past 2 years, has been about empowering their right to their own learning or empowering their voice. Student choice drives almost every piece of my classroom. And it wasn't always like that. I used to hand kids passages and say, hey, answer these 10 questions. And sometimes they're multiple choice and sometimes they're a long answer. But the more I do this job and trust the process and trust that kids want to learn, Donald Graves, one of the great writing workshop gurus of research of teaching kids how to write, one of my favorite quotes by him is he says, kids want to learn. And they do. They absolutely do. What makes kids not want to learn is school. And I'm not talking school as in learning. I'm talking the politics of school. I'm talking these grades that really mean nothing. I'm talking about this work that means nothing. And everything every choice that I've made in the last several years has to been like, do I need that, or can I do that in a better way? Can I teach a kid how to write a sentence while properly using a comma without doing sentence diagramming? Do I have to put 10 examples of a sentence with a comma, or can we notice great literature and go, why does this sentence work? Why is this sentence longer than this one? Why did the author make that decision? And when you model that thinking in authentic books and authentic texts that they care about, what they do is they go, oh, I can do that. And then you have them do it in their writing. And they go off into their writing. And I'll never say, hey, we learned about this today, go do that. What I say is, hey, we talked about this. What are some ways that we could use this if it comes up? And then if I'm sitting with them, because I sit with them all day in a conference with my students pretty much for 45 minutes of our block, I'll go, hey, look at this. You have this paragraph it's kind of long, but you have like 4 simple sentences here. What happens if we combine these two? Do you think that would speed up the reader? And we have those conversations, and we talk about, does this piece work? And I give my kids the freedom to grade their own papers, because I want them to tell me what grade they think they should get and why. Because why should the teacher be the 100%? Well, I'm not a guru. I don't have all of the answers. And writing is so subjective anyway. So when they're writing a piece, you could read, if you ever you ever want proof of this, just go find your favorite book on Amazon and go click on that 1-star link and read all the people that hated the book that you loved. And you'll realize that reading and writing are so subjective. What I think is amazing, you could think is horrible. And I think to make my kids not be beaten down by writing, we have to accept that. So I have conversations. I go, hey, this piece, I was like, I understand what you're doing, but it's not working for me. Go find 3 other people and see if it works for them. See what they say. And sometimes they win. Sometimes they're like, hey, I had 3 people and they really love this. I'm like, awesome. So what grade do you think this gets based on your effort? And that is all of those things I just listed. That's my attempt to empower their authentic learning. The only way to become a better writer is to write. The only way to become a better reader is to read. Now, there's some skills along the way that I can give you to kind of streamline that process, but nothing beats volume. And the more I do this and the more I trust the process, it just works. Like I have kids who they write in their, what I call their draft book, and they're just drafting in their journals and they're revising and editing. And when they publish, after they've gone through the writing process, they go on the computer and they share it through Google and send it to me. I get stuff sent to me at all hours. I get it in the morning before school. I'll get a piece turned in. I'll get 3 this weekend, because the kids are just writing because they care. Now, if I turned that around and said, hey, you're writing about this and it's due this day, I would do nothing but chase grades and give needless punishments because of a kid's lack of effort. But if I can get them to write on their off time and be excited to put something out there, that's just a win. So in terms of them walking away with something, I hope they realize that their voice matters and that they can choose what they want and still learn. I think this old mentality of, the old factory worker idea of what education was, I think it's outdated, and I don't want to limit my students to that anymore.
I couldn't agree more. And when you're giving them that choice, they're so much more motivated. Everyone loves to talk about themselves and to dig deeper into their own interests. So when you can do that in your classroom, where you're giving them the space to be able to dig into their own interests, get to know themselves better, get to know their interests better, go down that rabbit hole that they have of, I just want to learn more about this topic. It's so exciting to see kids want to be doing this learning. And as you said, kids want to learn, like humans want to learn. We are built to learn. So it's awesome that you're giving them that space to have the chance to do that. A lot of things you shared, I think lots of teachers listening can take some of these ideas into their own classrooms and give that freedom. Now, Oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to point out for anyone listening, like, you know, you hear about like authentic writing and reading. Like, I always say I don't give prompts and I don't assign books. And to English teachers, sometimes that's like hive inducing to say that, especially high school teachers.
Yeah.
But for middle school teachers as well, and some, you know, upper elementary, like that whole idea of what are they writing about? You know, do I just say right? No, like, you know, this process, it takes time. You know, I didn't start authentic reading and writing right off the bat. You know, where it started with reading was, hey, we're going to read for 15 minutes, whatever you want. You read a comic, you read a graphic novel, you read this book, you read that book. That's where it started a few years ago, right? Just 15 minutes a day. And then I slowly evolved that into a little bit more responsibility. And now it's a very fluid motion of they're reading what they want and writing what they want, and they're expanding in so many ways, and I can manage it. But no one listening to this think that like you just jump in and hope for the best. Like I did my research. You know, I read Nancy Atwell and I read Penny Kill and I read Kelly Gallagher and I read Jeff Anderson and I read all the major people and I read Donald Graves, and that stuff slowly over time informed me. But, you know, if you're wanting to add more authenticity to your work, if you're wanting to give kids more freedom, start small. Reading or writing, doesn't matter which side. Start somewhere where you can give them freedom and test the waters. And I think what will happen is once you do that, your kids are going to be so empowered, and you're going to be so empowered that you're going to go, okay, what else can I take away? Like, why? What other restriction on their learning can I remove so we have fun in school?
Yeah, I love that. So to end this amazing conversation, which I'm loving, I feel like we could chat forever. um, could you leave our listeners with, I think one thing that, and one of the reasons we brought you on today is to talk about that piece of how can we be there for our students, especially when they're going through something difficult at home. So if you could leave, you know, our listeners with, say, one piece of advice for how they can really be there for their students, no matter what's going on in their students' lives at the time, what piece of advice would you give?
There's a couple things, you know, with the big talk on social media, you know, is always teacher self-care, right? And I think that you cannot take care of your kids if you're not taking care of yourself. But what I like to do is flip this idea on its head, which is a lot of people mean that for teachers to go off and, you know, get into a bubble bath or to go relax and do what they want and refuel themselves, whatever that is. And that's great. And if that stuff fuels you, then go ahead and go do that. But I love talking to the other side of people like me who I feel worst when I am doing stuff that isn't my passion. My passion is teaching. I love doing this job. And just like people can feel guilty for leaving work at contract time, people can feel guilty for working late. And people can feel guilty for putting so much effort. But I'm going to tell you that if it's fueling you, if it's fueling what you do it. If it's not, get rid of it or change it somehow. It's really the only two options you have if you want to live a happy life. And the reason I say that first is because you need to be in the right space to take care of children. And I think that it's unfair to assume that everyone is constantly in the right space. And, you know, throughout the year, you might ebb and flow, and you might be killing it in October and you might be dragging in February. But the one thing I say is the number one thing that hurts teachers the most when it comes to taking care of kids is we have to be mindful, and we really have to be mindful of this, of how we talk about the time off that we have. And what I mean by that is if every day all you're doing is counting down to Friday, and if every week you're counting down to the next break in front of your kids, and if you're on social media, if you have a teacher Instagram or something like that, and kids follow that, that is something that I think it undermines your connection with your kids, whether you believe it or not. Because I was that kid sitting in your classroom that did not want to go home. I didn't want to have Christmas break because that meant 2 weeks away from my school. It meant 2 weeks away from my teachers. And there are kids in there that you probably don't even know that's the way they think. And it's true. And they might not even realize they're thinking that. But it is just a fact of life. And I think that if we really want to take care of our children, we need to make them believe, whether we're feeling it or not, that they are literally the most important thing. We have to fill up their cups so that they always feel like they're comfortable in love, because students will not learn in an environment where they are not feeling safe or not feeling wanted or not feeling cared for. And I know it's a lot to ask of teachers, and I know it's a lot to ask to kind of swallow what you're doing. And I've gotten some pushback. Some people are like, I should be honest when I'm not having a good day. I'm not saying lie about your existence, right? To go back to one of the first things we said on the podcast, I'm not saying sit there and be fake for your kids. But what I am saying is give out so much compassion to them and love, because they deserve it. It's not their fault. It's not their fault that what's happening in their world. There's so many things that are, when a child is misbehaving, they're showing us a need, and it's our job to figure out what that need is. And to do that, we have to be able to get ourselves in the right mind space to be able to support them in whatever that looks like for you, whatever your style is, whatever your level of connection that you want with your students. And for me, that means just investing so much into my work and going home and reading teacher books and listening to podcasts and podcasting with people and calling friends up and asking them teacher questions. Like, that stuff makes me feel better. And when I don't do that, I'm a worse teacher because I'm less happy. But other people need to go cook, and they need to go hang out with their family, and they need a date night with the husband or wife, or they need to hang out with their kids, and that stuff does it for me too. But the better you take care of yourself, the better you can take care of your students. And in the end, all that really matters at the end of the day, you ignore test scores, ignore content, ignore all of these things. What children need is an adult that cares about them. And you might be the only one. You might be the 50th one. It doesn't matter. The more, the merrier. We have to be that for kids, because that is going to set them up for the most success, regardless of if they make an A in your class or an F in your class. They need that in order to be successful people when they grow up.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so happy we were able to connect, and that we're going to be able to share your story with our community, because there's so many times during this conversation that I just got goosebumps. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I love it.
Well, that was such an awesome interview. I hope that you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed doing this interview. It definitely got my wheels turning on how I can be the teacher that cares in my students' lives, even if I'm not physically in the same space as them, even if school is looking a little bit different these days, or quite different these days. We would love to hear what your takeaways were from this episode. Connect with us on Instagram at EduCalm, that's EduCalme, and let us know what your ideas are for how to create those connections with your students, even if you aren't in the same room as them. We will link everything from this episode in our show notes. So if you want to connect with Jacob, we'll have links to his podcast and his social media handles. So you can find all that at educalm.com. So that's EduCalme, educalm.com/TBE108, as in The Balanced Educator, episode 108. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful week.